In this tutorial, we'll learn about importing resources and turning them into useful assets inside the Xenco Game Studio. We will also learn how to manage all those resources for our project in a convenient and structural way. Let's say that I have a couple of textures, a PNG and a JPEG file, and I want to turn them into a texture asset. There are two ways of doing that. The first way is by going to the asset view in our project and clicking on the Add Asset button. This will give us a list of all the possible assets that we can have in our project. Not all of these asset types require a raw resource file, but in our case it does. So we're going to go to the Texture option, and we're going to click on the Color option, which requires a single texture. In later tutorials, we'll cover textures and materials in more detail. Now we happen to be at the right location of our texture, which in this case is my desktop. This is going to be important later on. But first let's have a look at how to actually do the import. If we want to make a texture asset, we require a single raw resource. However, if we happen to have multiple resources of the same asset type, we can select both of them and click on Open. Notice that in this drop-down here, we get a list of all the possible file types that fulfill the criteria for a texture, so the DDS, JPEG, PNG, TGA, and so on. If we then click on Open, notice how the textures are now imported and we have texture assets in our game project. Depending on the type of asset that you're creating using this Add Asset button, you can get a different kind of window. For instance, if we would click on the Model option, we would get an entire dialog on whether we want to include any materials, textures, or animation files. Again, not all asset types require a raw resource. Now, before we move on to the second way of importing resources, it is very good to notice at what location the textures that we've just imported are actually located. Let's select one of these textures here and then go to the property grid. Notice now that I am hovering over the source, it says C users, Yoran, and then it says something like desktop. This is a really bad location. Why is that? Let's say that I'm sharing this project, my game folder, with someone else, and he tries to load the project, but then all of these textures, they're suddenly no longer there. They cannot be found. And that is because that texture is at my computer somewhere on my desktop, and that path is no longer correct. And for that reason, it is very common practice to have a resources folder inside your project. We can do that by either clicking with our right mouse button on our project inside the Solution Explorer and then simply clicking on Create Folder. Or if we happen to have an Explorer window open, we could show the window and then create a resources folder in there. As a matter of fact, all the Xenco documentation pages as well as all the example projects all use this kind of setup. We have the assets, which are created inside of Xenco Game Studio, and all its raw resources, they are stored inside the resources folder. That's what I'm going to do from now on. For now, I'm just going to copy the resources that I need for my project into this specific resources folder. That also directly brings us to the second way of importing resources, and that is by simply dragging and dropping them. Let's remove the two previous textures for a moment, and let's import them again. All I have to do now is select the texture that I want to import, or select both of them, in this case, and simply drag them inside the asset view. Notice this green overlay on top of the asset view. Xenco Game Studio will then ask me what kind of texture I want to create. In this case, it's a color texture. Lastly, it's good to notice that when you select multiple files of different file types, we can get a different dialog. For instance, if I would select two textures and an FBX model, and I would try to drag this into the asset view, notice how we now get a different list of options. To the right, it will tell me that 1 out of 3 files is now suited to create a 3D model out of, and that only 2 out of 3 files is suited to create a texture out of. We cannot create both a model and a color texture at the same time, so we have to make a choice here. In our case, I'm just going to go for the 3D model. Again, in this case, we get a different window because it asks us if we want to import any materials or textures. More on importing models in a later tutorial where we go into far more detail on how to do this in the best possible way.